So I thought I would try sitting outside. Um, I realize now I'm underneath a direct flight path today, so probably not the best idea. There are several key aspects of anger and how we experience it, make sense of it, deal with it. It just feels like they're being rushed over and almost like we all have consensus on that. And actually, I think that is part of the problem more widely with anger and emotions, perhaps. I don't think there is an intricate enough understanding of them as internal experiences and as motivational systems that have deep roots into our unconscious and deep roots into our earliest days and years of life, and the influence, obviously, that has on how we behave. And so, even though I think a lot of what I just said, many people would agree with, I think, did a bird just try and land on me?
Okay, I've had to relocate inside. A few things I wanted to touch on around the topic of anger that might be useful to the conversation that's evolving over at the net, or for anyone who's interested in anger. First of all, the distinction between an internal experience versus outward action is really important here. And there's a lot of overlap in these conversations, I find, between anger, being angry, and well, I guess being angry as a phrase is probably a great place to start. To say, when we're being angry or when I'm being angry, that we all know what that means. I actually think that that phrase being angry points already to the conflation, uh, to the confusion around the emotion that occurs internally versus how I am now acting out in the world. And even the phrase being angry, often a lot of people are sort of nodding as though that has an agreed upon understanding of what that means. And I'm imagining uh, it's sort of that the acting out, acting impulsively, saying things in a heated manner that you might later regret, lacking sufficient foresight, rash decision making, coming from more of an anxious place. That's what I imagine is meant by this being angry. And yet being angry could mean all sorts of things. First of all, are we talking about noticing the internal experience of the anger inside? Are we talking about the lack of noticing that internal experience inside? Are we talking about how we behave in that moment? Are we talking about this fusion of anxiety and anger? So are we actually talking about how we respond to the fact that we get anxious about our anger? I think too, this is an important phrase to look at because sometimes the not being angry in a particular situation, if we really examine it, could seem like a problem too. Say you are in the workplace and a piece of work that you spent a really long time on suddenly gets critiqued in a really uncaring, cold manner by someone, it would make sense that a person might feel some anger in that scenario, but actually to look at scenarios where people report not noticing any anger. And that in and of itself could, I think, is also just as relevant to this conversation, which to me sounds like it's centering around what is anger, what might the purpose of anger be, how can we work with anger, how can we integrate anger into our actions? So in my mind, anger is a basic primal emotion that's hardwired into all of us. We all have the capacity for anger. And we come to some kind of relationship to consciously noticing that emotion arising within us. We come to some kind of relationship to that very early on in life. And then obviously there's all sorts of ways that could be reinforced. And it is the manner in which we have come to relationship to the noticing of anger being elicited inside us that can look all sorts of different ways on the outside, can influence how we behave in those moments in all sorts of different ways. And also, there are varying degrees of how in touch or how conscious we are to even notice the anger signal inside us when it starts to occur. And there is a lot of confusion around noticing anxiety, noticing something anxious inside us at a time where it might make sense to feel anger, or some kind of like mix of the two together, at least, and thinking, believing, naming that as the anger signal inside us, right? This is the anger. And I think you can see that confusion actually when we sort of consider what is the difference between anxiety and anger. You know, how do you feel anxiety in your body and how do you feel anger in your body, if we start there? But there is a manner in which we come to relate to the noticing of anger signals that are hardwired into us. It's my contention anyway that these signals are elicited outside of our control. And so this is not a task of being able to learn methods to not have anger signals elicited inside, if we put it in those terms. I mean, there's ways you could attempt to do that by trying to avoid ever being in any kind of context where anything could ever lead you to not like something, or but you know, to have anger elicited, sure, and that would be a very, very restricted way of living. But it's more so the case that this is an emotion like the other emotions that will be evoked, elicited, triggered from time to time, from day to day, while we are out in the world acting, and especially when we are interacting with other people, when we are in relationship. So in our attempts to connect and in our attempts to relate, in my mind, there will necessarily be anger evoked within us. And to me, that's pretty normal and healthy. There's no problem to that. I guess in its kind of healthier sense, I see anger as actually being part of what allows us to stand up for ourselves, part of what allows us to have an independence to be an individual. I really see it that way. It can be the inner feeling that allows us to stand up straight, to hold our ground, to be determined, even in the face of others telling us, you know, you'll never be able to do that, or we don't agree, or whatever it is. Our ability to have agency nonetheless. There is a link, obviously, between this more kind of healthy form of anger and will, and noticing that inside us there are very clear, strong preferences. There are desires to try particular things, take a particular course of action. I think it is actually in being able to connect into our anger that we can have the strength. We can have the strength to have convictions and to make decisions, and to not have to just follow the herd, to live out what feels closer to an authentic self and set of decisions and way of being in the world. Now, obviously, not for this discussion. I mean, obviously, that's going to come to a particular friction with, being in relation with others, being connected to others, caring for others, having others be dependent on us. There are obviously all of these factors that are important in the mix here, but in a very simplified sense, part of what I see is the importance of being able to get clear about anger and understand how its charge can be used in a way that is healthy, creative, even connecting, is to notice that it comes with a sort of a wanting to sit up straight, like it has a momentum to it and a surety to it, which is, needless to say, checks and balances around all of that, so that it doesn't just become sort of blind rigidity. And but I'll put that to one side. If we kind of assume all those things, that kind of experience of anger, I don't think it is at all what most people would consider their experience of anger. What I've been finding in the last few net conversations about anger is that there is sort of this focus on how can we, use our higher order thinking to better understand and work with and modify our behavior in the context of anger inside. But I think, first of all, we need to make that firmer distinction about there's the feeling inside, and then there is how we behave. Those two things do not necessarily follow from one another. There's ways that we can differentiate those two, and that actually the manner in which we might find ourselves habitually responding to noticing these feelings inside is often an old, outdated system that is responding actually about the fact that we feel incredibly anxious about our anger, or that we want to ensure that we never notice consciously that we feel anger. That's also important. So the idea that I'm suggesting here, which is not my idea, I'm drawing this from ISTDP, and there's also a psychoanalytic tradition, but really at its heart, I guess this is more linked to Dav and Lieu's ideas, who created ISTDP. The method through which we come to relate to anger in our very early days, years of life, can lead to a fusion of anxiety that comes once the anger just starts. So it's like once the anger is evoked and it's just starting to be, I guess, turned on inside us, then the alarm bells start ringing. Something in our psyche notices that this is happening, this is bad, anger is not good, anger is not good in this particular relational configuration. So then we're flooded with anxiety. And anxiety can come in lots of different forms too. It's not necessarily so that it's the anxiety that you might most associate with anxiety. It can be that you start to feel nauseous in your stomach. It can be that all of a sudden you have to go to the bathroom. It can be that you go very foggy in your head. You start to actually lose touch with reality. Your ears might start ringing. These are all ways in which you are being flooded with anxiety. And the question here is around, what is it about our anger that makes us so anxious? And I think that's the bit, I think that at its core is the bit that has been missing from the net conversations that I just wanted to bring in, is that in this sort of inquiry around anger, I think we're missing a piece. It's not, when I talk about not paying more attention to the internal experience of the anger rather than rushing to talk about what we're doing with our actions and how can we figure out better ways of acting when we feel anger, and what can meditation show us, and how can we slow it down so that the anger doesn't overtake our actions, and all these things is essentially part of what I think I'm hearing. I think it misses the point that actually we're anxious. The kind of anger, anyway, that's being spoken about, that kind of angry behavior, I think, that's being spoken about, to me sounds like an acting out. We are anxious, and so we act impulsively, right? We act impulsively from the anxiety, not from the anger. I think it was Thomas. Someone said something about, well, that might sort of be so, but regardless, the question kind of remains the same. Like, it's ultimately anger that's sort of driving that whole system. So figuring out how to deal with your anger so that all that doesn't take place is still just as important. Yes, I agree. But it's the method through which we would go about trying to fix that, I guess. Like, what is the in? If we're just accepting that anger is always going to come with anxiety, that's just how it is, then sure, we can talk about all sorts of ways that to try and work on your behavior and modify it when that happens. But what about being able to figure out why on earth would your anger be making you so anxious in the first place? Why have those two things been stuck together somewhere in your psyche? And perhaps there's something we could do about that. Perhaps we could actually separate the two so that they're no longer fused, so that when anger arises, you're no longer at the mercy of your overwhelming flooded anxiety. That would be my question. I just think it's sort of a direction question. It's rather than, oh yeah, anxiety comes with anger, sure, but like we still need to figure out, well then, how do we learn better ways of behaving when that happens? Well, how about we could actually look at the experience of what goes on when it happens, which is this, like, really slowing down what goes on inside and trying to understand deeply why are those two things fused together? What is so threatening? What is so scary about your anger? What is it that something inside you decided we should never look at that? We should never come into too much conscious contact with that. That feeling should never be allowed to hang around for too long when you're relating to someone, so much so that it's doing all these things to try to get you to move out of the position you're in that's eliciting the anger. It wants to cloud the anger. It wants to suppress it, repress it. This can look all sorts of ways as well. It's not just the acting out anxious kind of discharge that we've been, or that I've heard at least being talked about at the Net. It is also people who would say that they never consciously notice feeling angry. No, I'm not. I don't get angry. That instead they might just be like people pleasers, very passive, depressed. There's all these ways that our psyche figures out how to ensure that we just don't ever consciously even notice we feel anger, because that's one way of never having to contend with it. And again, you can see how a person loses their backbone, loses their ability to have a real authenticity and a will, and where needed, an authority. So that's a problem. And then there's also the kind of anger that a person only ever consciously notices when they believe it's towards themselves. So this protects the other, right? This is the person who is, no, I'm not angry. It's never angry at you. Oh, no, I'm not angry at you. I'm just angry at myself. And this is a pattern, right? That they tend to, rather than notice that they feel anger and its direction, which is the other person, instead they only apply it to themselves. It gets turned inward. Or it's very vague. I'm angry at the world. I'm just angry at the world, or I'm angry at it's not you, it's just the situation we find ourselves in. Right. So this is like, there's a non-directness there. So these are different ways in which anger can be experienced by a person. It's not just the fact that it leads to impulsive acting out. I mean, this area is huge, and so I'm not going to go into this now because there's so many different ways that we could talk about how this goes. But at the root of it is this idea that there has been some kind of trauma to our relationship to this feeling from very early on, and that there's a real difficulty in knowing what to do about that and how to rectify that trauma. And so my suggestion would be, and I know, look, there's many paths to the same center. I'm not saying this is the only way, but what I've seen in my work and in the therapy approach that I use is that there needs to be a direct confrontation with the full experience of the anger. There needs to be some kind of way of following the natural path of the anger inside, which includes the impulse. So it's the aggressive impulse that comes with anger can be part of what is so frightening to look at for a person. If we trace back to thinking about anger when we are very young and when we are first forming our relationship to this experience inside ourselves, you can see how noticing an aggressive impulse towards your parent, your caretaker, your sibling, which is just a natural part of what comes with anger, So that could go all sorts of ways. That's quite a confronting experience for a child. Then you have to take into consideration how the system around that child treats that child in that scenario, and whether or not noticing the aggressive impulse is allowed, is tolerated, is supported, is accepted, is rejected, punished, neglected, ignored, all these things. And so a child's ability to learn what is and isn't normal about just the internal experience of anger as a starting point. It's actually very normal that it comes with an impulse to lash out and hurt someone within the context of a loving relationship as well, which is part of what's so frightening for a child. That's normal. And then to learn some kind of parameters around the difference between noticing that inside versus acting it out in reality, right? That, it's not something to be done in reality because it would have all these consequences. However, to notice the impulse inside is perfectly normal. And then to learn that in being able to notice that inside themselves, to learn over time that the noticing of that inside themselves does not lead them to lose control and do the thing. But they have to have been given the circumstances in which to have those experiences to learn that. And so this fear of a loss of control is also at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about anxiously fused anger. And so I just wanted to read a brief quote from one of the books by Habib Davinliu, who was the doctor who developed ISTDP. And this is from a transcript with a patient of his. They were in the middle of doing an inquiry, looking at a painful event in the patient's life. And the patient said, "I don't know. I guess I thought about it. My negative feelings, if they are there, they're very deep because I don't really feel them. I've probably hidden them if they are there." And then the therapist says, you repeatedly say guess and probably, and you don't want to face your real feelings. And that is the reason you pay such a heavy price by being insecure, being constantly afraid of being rejected, not standing on your own 2 feet, and trying to play the role of nice girl in order to be liked by people, giving up on your own self rather than being a free human being, to be you as you really are in your own right. And I think that captures the heart of one of the ways in which the way we relate to anger can go wrong very early on, that leads to something quite different to what we have been talking about at the Net, of the impulsive acting out of anger. And this is an example of how actually loss of healthy relationship to anger can also go other directions. It can also lead someone to be overly passive, to be trying to be nice all the time, this, overcompensating and losing contact with the very emotion that can be used to help one have some conviction and to stand one's ground and make a decision about something that might be in the face of what everyone else thinks is a good decision. All of these things. My perception anyway is that to look at one's feelings is almost seen as the easier activity. It's like, yeah. Okay, like it doesn't take long and you kind of just do it. And yeah, I know what I feel now. Now let's go into the kind of big intellectual realm where we'll try and make sense and moralize and philosophize and wonder and ponder on how to then behave in light of this information. I don't sign off on the idea that it's that way around. I actually almost think it's the other way around. There are obviously certain kinds of feelings that, yeah, it's pretty simple. Yeah, I realized, I looked and I saw what my feeling was and I gave myself a moment to connect to it, and sure. And there is a place, obviously, to sit and to really grapple with how am I going to behave? Like, this is really complicated, sure. But there are a set of feelings, deep feelings, and our relationship to key feelings that are not so easy to face, that our mind has created a myriad of ways to keep us disconnected and distant from. And one of the ways that might manifest is actually through that rushing that sort of sense of rushing when we go, yeah, I've looked at the feeling, I understand. Now let's move on to the serious, like the serious stuff, the important stuff of trying to philosophize and understand what I'm going to do now, and what's the correct way to live with this. And sometimes that impulse can actually be part of what keeps us from being able to notice and really fully face the feelings. And so I wouldn't discount that step, the facing the feelings. I think it's not so simple. And we have so many automatic ways that we are defended from doing it with certain emotions and in certain contexts, that we should be curious to that, and being genuinely curious to it and purposely slowing down and really paying attention to the full feeling inside. And with that often comes a whole heap of anxiety. And so having to sit and work through the anxiety as well, and to choose to not allow that anxiety to take us off track, all these sorts of things, is actually really difficult work for many people. There is something that is incredibly healing about, I mean, as Davin says, to face feelings because they are honest and straightforward. Once we finally can do it, there is something incredibly healing about it. And if we're going to talk about the kind of more impulsive, anxious flavor of anger, that anxiety clears up. So now when you experience anger, it doesn't come with all that anxiety. So you're far less likely to act impulsively. You have much more control over your actions, your choice. You'll be much less fearful of losing control. But it requires a process of being able to look at the deepest, darkest, sometimes most confrontational and scary parts of oneself inside, and to look at impulses that come with this primal feeling of anger, which, are aggressive in nature, coming face to face with the idea that inside all of us, that we are capable of reaching out and hurting another person, destroying another person, all of these things. And that is separate to any comment on how we hold ourselves in reality, how we actually behave in reality. And that is the part we may be able to have some control over, obviously. However, the impulses that come with feelings, we do not have control over. It is only how we act in the world that we have control over. I could go on for a long time, and I'm sure there's a manner in which I can make this much more concise and organized, but I thought I would grab the time while I had it. And so I just wanted to leave you with that. Hopefully something in there was of interest to the conversation.